Hello, welcome to another edition of TAINA Talks. My name is Sutton and I'm the tax SME here at TAINA. Today we wanted to commemorate 10 years of the Foreign Account Tax Compliant Act, or FATCA. TAINA Talks is our new series of articles and podcasts where we speak with industry thought leaders and professionals. Together, we'll explore how industry cooperation, engagement, and feedback can lead to comprehensive insights, and we hope also solves persisting industry challenges. FATCA was signed into law in 2010 as part of the Hiring Incentives to Restore Employment Hire Act. Its goal, to combat offshore tax evasion by U.S. taxpayers. Under FATCA, foreign financial institutions, or commonly referred to as FFIs, are required to report to the IRS information on financial accounts held by U.S. persons. This legislation represented a bold step towards greater transparency in the global financial system, and it predates the internationally adopted Common Reporting Standards, or the CRS. But while the law was passed in 2010, it wasn't fully in effect until July 1st, 2014. By then, FATCA had truly begun affecting the operations of financial institutions around the world. And as you can imagine, implementing such a broad-reaching law didn't come without significant challenges. Now joined by Cyrus Daftary Principal from KPMG, and Kazimi, one of the leaders at Hansuke. We asked these gentlemen to share with us their experiences with FATCA. Their consulting roles have allowed them to see firsthand many of the pain points firms experienced in the beginning and what are still persisting challenges for many today. What are some of the key challenges financial institutions faced when FATCA was first introduced?
FATCA was something that I think the global community had to really digest because it was a very much complex regulations. You're talking about trying to comply with U.S. rules and a whole new set of processes. And I think the challenge one was obviously operationally things had to change, but that meant there was a change in the sense of a lot of training and communication that had to go internally and externally. It required process changes and, if you will, technological changes to account for all the reporting that was required. And then the question was, how do you really come up with a budget? And then understanding, particularly for some of the larger global institutions where you've got different business units, the impact could change based off the various countries. And then, of course, how you manage it. Do you have regional ROs and how do you manage the risk? So really, it was a big ask, from a people, process, and technology perspective, and it was something I think that was clearly much harder than the QI regime that a lot of financial institutions, went through.
I think the key things that initially that firms had was, first of all, that was what I would say is the legal and regulatory uncertainty, because FATCA was clearly the first of its kind. No other measure like this had ever been introduced. It was quite extra-jurisdictional. So that was the first hurdle that many financial institutions had across the globe. How will they report? Are they allowed to report, given their own central banks and their data protection rules and regulations? Once we had got over that hurdle, then the next challenge was really what I would classify as the human resistance. And this was twofold. So there were people within the financial institutions who did not want to comply. They thought that it was too much. And there was also reluctance on part of customers of the financial institutions who just did not want their information to be sent on a cross-border basis. So these were some environmental sort of like challenges. Besides that, the actual rules themselves, they were quite complex. Nobody had seen anything like that. There were intricacies to do with pre-existing accounts, new accounts, and some of those challenges still dock the industry, and they're not easy to implement. There were process changes that needed to be implemented. So the whole onboarding of customers by financial institutions needed to be recalibrated to a new regime. And finally, dare I say, there were the additional costs of compliance. And I think that was when you haven't budgeted for things and all of a sudden you have a big program that you need to put in place. So these were some of the key challenges right at the outset, whatever, a decade ago.
Sure, that makes sense. How about a couple years later, the common reporting standards came live? Have you seen like an overlap of similar issues, or was FATCA kind of a unique situation compared to the common reporting standard?
Well, I think FATCA clearly made CRS much more tenable for people to, manage, because at least they understood some of the functions. We had weird, if you have vernaculars where, let's talk about a self-cert. You had a self-cert for FATCA purposes, you had a self-cert for CRS purposes, but they weren't exactly the same self-cert. So, some people created combined self-certs and things like that. But I do think FATCA made trying to implement CRS a little easier. Of course, you didn't have any withholding implication with CRS, really much more a reporting regime. I mean, although FATCA was always labeled as a reporting regime, that's what the IRS always touted, that we want to have better reporting. CRS clearly had that. But I do think CRS created some challenges as well for firms. One of the things we did see, though, is we saw some people leverage the CRS opportunity to kind of revisit what they did with FATCA and iron out, I think, some kinks that they, may have known existed or realized as you go to operationalize something that existed. And so I do think CRS, again, it was very complicated. I'm not minimizing what the effort was, but I think it was something much more manageable, just given the FATCA framework and what people had been through. And they were able to manage, if you will, the due diligence versus the reporting, I think much easier, in a much easier manner.
Okay, so FATCA started 10 years ago. The enforcement maybe was slow to start, but since its introduction, how have you seen FATCA enforcement evolve? And kind of a little caveat to that, how much has international cooperation played a role in that enforcement?
From an enforcement perspective, you're right. I think the first few years, everyone was really recognizing that it takes time to, put in the appropriate systems and change management to make things work. We know that typically it's at least 18 months to 2 years just to get the systems right. And then, of course, you've got to operationalize it, and you've got to condition whether it's the front office or the back office on how to manage all the changes. So I do think that, the IRS and other governments, when it came to CRS, were really giving financial institutions time to get it implemented. But obviously enforcement, has started. We've seen more enforcement over the past few years, right? The enforcements have started with inquiries, or when you look at Cayman, they wanted more information, for example, around nil reports. We know, for example, Bermuda, you have to submit your policies and procedures as a part of your filings. And those then, of course, led to, inquiries and further audits. So we know around the globe that there have been inquiries from the various jurisdictions just to make sure enforcement's there. And, in a way, that's good, because then people realize they've spent a lot of money, and financial institutions have quantified what they spend, and they've always asked, what is the return on that spend? But I do think governments are obviously starting to look at the enforcement, and we're clearly seeing the IRS do the same thing on their end, making sure that they're looking at people's compliance around FATCA. And so, the enforcement has come. But to your point, I do think that the governments were sympathetic because they had to obviously allow each of the financial institutions to operationalize the regulations and get it properly implemented. And frankly, on the government side, they're receiving a lot of information too, right? They had to really learn how to ingest this information and really make sure that they could come up with meaningful inquiries, because they obviously didn't want to knock on doors and start making inquiries when the data was in front of them. But so we're seeing more and more inquiries around the globe around compliance, but I think it's to be expected, and I think the pace that it's come at has been reasonable, just to make sure people got it right.
Sure, I think the point, to your point, the initial approach by tax authorities was to take a light touch approach, which was to educate and help and support financial institutions to become compliant. What we've seen, or we were seeing just before the sort of like the COVID lockdowns, was that was turning towards more of a inspection regime now. So they were expecting financial institutions to have adopted the new measures and comply with them. Then everything obviously was suspended for the next 2-3 years. And what we've seen in the last couple of years is the audit programs have really stepped up. So you're getting tax authorities across the globe in jurisdictions such as obviously the United Kingdom, where I'm sitting from today, Singapore, Hong Kong, Canada, Luxembourg. Each of these jurisdictions, I have been supporting financial institutions to meet with the growing audit requirements and how to manage those audit programs. The other enforcement action, as you sort of like rightly pointed out, is there is now a new set of legislation that has come into play. These are domestic pieces of legislation, perhaps driven by wider AML, KYC, financial crime considerations, but you've seen jurisdictions such as the Cayman Islands who have now regulations that explicitly mention penalties for non-compliance, including criminal liability. So they will impose penalties, and which include fines and even imprisonment of certain officers. So you can see there's a real shift in what financial institutions need to comply. Another jurisdictions where I'm doing quite a lot of work is in the United Arab Emirates, where you've got a fine, say, of 1,000 dirhams. That's about £200 or 250 USD for that is imposed on the financial institution for each new account that basically is opened without obtaining valid self-cert, and or where there's been a failure by the FI to validate such self-certification. Now you can imagine from a documentation perspective, I mean, I've seen many people send out the forms, but they don't have any validation process in place. They don't know how to validate. So for a bank which has got, say, for example, 1 million accounts, and there's a 20% documentation failure rate, that would give rise to about a £40 million fine or $50 million fine. So these costs can really escalate very, very quickly. So I think that's kind of brought it home to many financial institutions that they need to take this seriously. I think the other challenge of the evolution side of things has been the new set of rules. So you've now got CRS 2.0. So it's already in the mind of the OECD to basically implement new data sets that weren't there before and to incorporate them into the reporting. Additionally, you've had within, say, for example, the FATCA side of things, the US has introduced new rules around TIN. So what you are seeing is the goalposts are shifting.
You mentioned why it's important to maintain compliance just because of the penalties. So why do you think that there are still financial institutions that aren't fully compliant with FATCA?
Well, first of all, many financial institutions never became compliant. So, or they didn't interpret the requirements properly. So they've been continuously not compliant. But even those institutions that did become compliant, I mean, this legislation is now nearly over a decade old. So there's naturally a compliance drift whereby, any systems of internal controls over time, those controls weaken. And you've seen sort of like staff movements. So there's all these type of things. And quite often these things weren't bedded down in the form of proper policy and procedures. So what happens is each person is doing, it's like, Chinese whispers, whereby you just follow what the last person has done without really understanding why these things were done. So there's that overall general passage of time and compliance drift that comes with it. I would say the other thing is we reached a point whereby, shortly after FATCA with the CRS implementation, we had already reached a level of what I would say is, fatigue in terms of compliance regimes and spending money, because what you have to look at is it wasn't just FATCA and CRS, then came things like MDR and DAX 6 and BEPS and ATED. So you've had a whole raft of legislation affecting financial institutions, and therefore the budgets just weren't there. So that resource constraint, I think, has played to the non-compliance. And dare I say, I mean, sort of like even now, there are systems which are out of date. So many people, and I see this, and this is an ongoing discussion, when you have audits and you realize there's been a compliance failure, many institutions will just patch up. What they won't do is look forward into the future and say, what are the AI tools? What are the technologies of the future that we need to incorporate now so it's fit for next 10 years rather than correcting and putting a plaster for the problems that have happened in the past? So I think that whole legacy system issue is a big problem. I mentioned to you the regulatory complexity hasn't got any less. It's actually now what we're seeing is the interdependence of different tax regimes. So it was just FATCA on its own or CRS on its own, and the two work closely. But now you have to make sure that you tie into your QI program, you tie it into your DAX 6 MDR program, and there are specific domestic regimes, such as in the UK, the corporate criminal offence, which is a tax integrity measure. So you have to sort of like start factoring those in. So again, as I said, the goalpost is moving. I would say that some of the the behavioral side of things, the reluctance to become compliant, largely is given way, but it's still there. So that resistance sometimes gets in the way of effective compliance.
No, I mean, I think at the end of the day, you can go around the globe and you're going to find in every jurisdiction, some firms that aren't compliant. And, there are different reasons for it. I mean, it could be a systemic issue. As we both know, a lot of institutions, there are certain subject matter experts, but when they leave, that knowledge walks out the door, right? So when that knowledge walks out the door, they lose a step. So I can't comment on I don't have any specifics, or I don't have any knowledge on those that may not be compliant, but I can tell you, as we've helped some firms, institutions, some of it has been really truly either a systemic glitch that happened. Maybe they switched from one vendor to another, and they thought something was compliant, it wasn't compliant. A key person has left the institution, and because they've left, the knowledge that they had, went out the door. But I do think, a lot of people and a lot of firms have really taken a step back, just given, the evolution, and, now it's more or less kind of BAU, business as usual. I think people have taken a step back and say, we ought to do our own checks, right? It's like the internal audit function, right? So, to the degree that the large institutions have that, they can go in and say, are we being compliant? We've got a regulatory obligation. Obviously, that's not necessarily true for funds where they don't have that type of an infrastructure. But again, they're relying on somebody to help them. So, hopefully, if there's some hiccups along the way, that there are hiccups that can be explained. I really think that, given the evolution of FATCA, CRS, and now we're going to have CARF, I do think that, firms have to have these processes in place. It's not a nice to have, it is really a must have. And, there, like I said, there always can be some kinks. It happens to the best of us, mistakes can happen. But again, I think just the way we rely on technology, or we rely on people, if we lose something, or like I said, that there's a glitch, then, that things happen. But I think the key is making sure that people are checking, and they've got controls to identify those hiccups, and then they react to them appropriately, and they remedy them. And if they need to make a disclosure, they can do that. Or if there's a knock on the door, then they're prepared to answer, the questions that are forthcoming, and then give the assurances that they've got the compliance where it needs to be. Part of it could just be growth, right? Or we see this sometimes with acquisitions where, it's not something that was core. It wasn't a big deal before, but now you've got a big acquisition, and you now have a huge compliance process that you've got to manage. So, I mean, I think part of it could be just growth. Part of it could be, vis-a-vis acquisition. Part of it, as I said, could be systemic issues, changing from one provider to the other, or losing a subject matter expert. So I really don't think, there's any FIs out there that are intentionally trying to be non-compliant. I do think that, it is driven either from a business, reason, or scope, or sometimes it's just these rules aren't easy, right? And when you think about, FATCA CRS, although we call CRS a common reporting standard, we know that it's not necessarily, exactly common, right? Different countries ask for different things, and there are different processes, and there are different technologies at times that you've got to send the data into. Or, Luxembourg, you have to, go through some key institutions before things can get submitted. So I think it's just, some of it could be educational, some of it could just be operational acquisition. But I don't think anybody at this stage, or at least I hope, there aren't any institutions at this stage that say that they're intentionally non-compliant. I do think they're just business reasons, and whether it's hyper growth, whether it's an acquisition, or just a matter of changing providers, and when you move from one provider to the other, sometimes people aren't looking at this level of compliance when they're looking at major system paradigm shifts.
Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you, Ali. Thank you, Cyrus, for joining me today to talk about FATCA. To those listening, stay tuned for future iterations of TAINA Talks to hear more insights from industry leaders and experts.